Good afternoon, everybody. We will be recording this session just for your notification. My name is Elaine Venter. I'm with GTAC, and it's my privilege this afternoon to facilitate this session. And welcome everybody who has joined us, colleagues from Treasury and Eastern Cape, and all other colleagues and friends who have joined us for the session this afternoon. As we approach Mandela Day, I thought it would be appropriate maybe to quote him on children, because we all know that children were always very close to his heart. He said he's got so many quotes, but one of his quotes, he said, "Few things in life make the life of a parent more rewarding and sweet as successful children." That's a very powerful quote, and I think it's very apt as we have this discussion this afternoon. And we are really privileged to have Amanda Jitsing, who's going to lead the discussion this afternoon, present to us on a spending review that was done on school infrastructure in the Eastern Cape. Amanda has a summary of her bios on the screen, so I don't need to go over it again, except to say that she's tremendously experienced, that it's clear from her bio that she's got a passion for this work and for this field, for this sector. And we're really, really privileged to have you, Amanda, to present on the work that was done on school infrastructure in the Eastern Cape. So without any further ado, I'm handing over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Elaine. I am going to put my screen on slideshow so you can see it, and say thank you to everyone who's joined us. It's a rather heavy topic for a Friday afternoon, school infrastructure in the Eastern Cape, but I'll try to make it as painless as possible. So what I thought I'd talk to you about is the spending review that the GTAC team helped the Eastern Cape do. This was a joint effort between GTAC and the Eastern Cape Provincial Treasury. So the spending review itself looks at school infrastructure and the school infrastructure program in the Eastern Cape. So what I'd like to cover today is, well, there are 5 questions I'd like to attempt answering in today's session. Well, first, why did we do a spending review on school infrastructure? Infrastructure projects actually, as they are notoriously difficult to do spending reviews on, and partly because a spending review requires a lot of data, it's data intensive, and often we don't have the systems that produce the type of data in South Africa that you need for an infrastructure spending review. Then I'd like to touch on, what were the problems with school infrastructure in the Eastern Cape, and, where are the bottlenecks in the delivery process? How much are we spending on school infrastructure, and how much was the Eastern Cape spending on school infrastructure? And lastly, the big ticket question, which is, what are we getting for the amount of money that we're spending? Elaine, if you allow me, by the show of hands, so that I know who's in the room. I know there's a lot of people from National Treasury, but are there is there anyone from province in the room, Elaine? Do you know?
Amanda, maybe we can just see by show of emojis, thumbs
Yes.
up, if we have anybody from Eastern Cape in the room. Yes, we do.
Okay, great stuff.
Quite a few.
Okay, great. So Michael has presented this, and so he'll know the slides. Okay, and are there any lights at the end of the tunnel? Because school infrastructure is a complex program, and particularly in against the history of the Eastern Cape and the challenges that it faces. You know, what can be done better? Are there any particular ways that we can accelerate the delivery of this infrastructure program? So I thought I'd start with a bit of context, and hopefully I've gotten this right. So this is the Eastern Cape Province, and this is a map of the Eastern Cape Province. The Eastern Cape, and this is very important in relation to the school infrastructure program. It consists of two former homelands, the Transkei and the Ciskei. Alongside a very rural province and very, you know, particularly in rural areas, they have amongst the lowest densities in South Africa, aside from the Northern Cape. You also have two metros, Buffalo City and Nelson Mandela Bay. So you have two metro centers and a largely rural province. So the province has about 1.7 million learners, or had about 1.7 million learners in 2021. And if you analyze the growth in learners over time, over this 5-year period, what you'll see is an emerging trend that there is migration happening from rural to urban. And so you can see Nelson Mandela Bay there, which is the metro, and Buffalo City growing at over 1%. And then you also have migration out of some of the rural areas like Amatole East, where you saw the number of learners decline by negative 1.3. So overall, very small marginal growth in the total number of learners, but there are stark differences across districts. So why did we want to do a spending review on school infrastructure in the province? Well, first of all, it is a very topical issue. I've just pulled out over the last 2 weeks the stories related to school infrastructure, you know, 2 months, sorry, the stories relating to infrastructure in the Eastern Cape. It is a topical. People are concerned about it. You know, there's a school recently. This was in last week's City Press, where a school is taking the Eastern Cape government to court, or the department to court, for a failure to provide basic facilities. There are learners protesting recently the removal of the deadlines for set out in the norms and standards, in the infrastructure norms and standards. And those protests largely revolve around removing the deadlines for eradicating backlogs, like in pit latrines. This school was burnt down about 2 years ago, and learners haven't had any space to learn, or they're at least getting only 4 hours of teaching time in a school. Another school, you know, the dispatch in the Eastern Cape reporting that, you know, half of the school had to be shut down because it couldn't be fixed. And more recently, you know, about 2 months ago, almost 3 months ago, the Eastern Cape Department of Education had to return money to the fiscus because it couldn't spend on its infrastructure grant. So it's a topical subject. There are real challenges, and it was picked as one of the reasons for the spending review. So if you look at the spending review, it identified 4 problems with school infrastructure, or at least 4 dimensions to the school infrastructure problem. The first one is that you have a historical backlog. And you can see, based on the maps, where this historical backlog is most pronounced in the former homelands, particularly around, you know, up sort of to the north of the province in the former Transkei. So massive historical context there. It is also important to remember that the Eastern Cape Department, just so that we know the history, brought together, when it was formed, it brought together the different administrations from the former homeland, and getting the department to consolidated and streamlined and to work together has been a massive challenge in itself. We also have a fair amount of migration. I already touched on intra-provincial migration between districts in the province. But you also have outbound migration. I think if you look at the Western Cape annual report, you'll see that I think it was either last year or the year before, it was probably the year before, they absorbed close to 5,000 learners from the Eastern Cape. Specifically in relation to the school infrastructure problem, you have a very small pool of contractors, and obviously if you have local content requirement or preferential procurement for local contractors, you then are looking to hire people from the small pool, and there's a number of unintended consequences of that, including charging the local contractors charging premium prices. And lastly, there is limited capacity, and it was really apparent throughout the spending review that there's limited capacity for procurement, contract management, cash flow management, monitoring and evaluation within the Eastern Cape Department of Education. So where is the delivery process? One of the things we do as part of a spending review is we try to map out the delivery processes. So where are the bottlenecks in the delivery processes? Well, there are a couple of bottlenecks throughout the delivery process, and that means that the infrastructure delivery process itself is not working optimally, and that leads to delays in the delivery itself of infrastructure. So there's process inefficiencies sitting in the infrastructure process. So let me take you through some of those. The first one happens, or at least the first set of challenges that we encountered happened in the planning phase, where there was where schools needed to submit their priority needs and to prioritize and a list of infrastructure projects, schools and districts, and obviously, there are, challenges with getting those lists, with making sure that those lists reflect the priorities of the provincial department. There's also interference. You must also remember that school infrastructure, in terms of, as an infrastructure project, brings a lot of money into a rural area, because there's an investment into that area, particularly given where we're investing in the Eastern Cape province. And you'll start generally seeing rent-seeking behavior, people wanting infrastructure here instead of where it's absolutely needed. So there's those set of issues around the planning process. Then what we also found is that there's limited coordination, and I must say that this has improved, but there's limited coordination between the Eastern Cape Department of Education, who administers the East Education Infrastructure Grant, and the DBE, who administers the School Backlog Grant. And as a result, you hear in several instances where the Department of Basic Education has built a school through the School Backlog Grant. It is, it's in an area that where learners are moving out of. So the school is then underutilized. Thankfully, these challenges have gotten better over the years, but these are some of the issues around lack of coordination, particularly when you have two grants flowing for the same thing. You also have a set of issues in the Eastern Cape where there's weaknesses in capacity amongst the implementing agents themselves. So how school infrastructure works, and it's the most prevalent model in South Africa, is that a Department of Education would typically hire an implementing agent like the IDT or DBSA or one of the big public entities. They would then implement on the department's behalf the school infrastructure program. But often what we find is that the implementation agencies themselves don't have the capacity. So there was a report where it was, one project manager in an implementing agent managing 26 contractors. That's almost impossible to manage effectively. You also have another set of issues around the actual availability of construction firms in the Eastern Cape and their ability and their capability to manage and deliver schools on time and within budget. So, there's been a couple of overruns on budgets, and part of that is firmly because, contractors don't have that capability to manage school infrastructure projects. There's also poor cash flow management by the Eastern Cape Department of Education, which means that there's often delays in paying contractors. Now, when there's delays in paying contractors and that becomes a norm in a province, contractors react in two ways. One, they price the risk of non-payment or delayed payment into their prices. And if they price in that risk, it means what you're paying for school infrastructure will automatically increase. And you must remember there's two sides of the coin. So they are pricing the risk that they will have there will be delays in the payment on the one hand, and on the other hand, you find a situation where contractors, there's a small pool of contractors that meet the preferential procurement requirements. So they have market power on one hand. We're economists. Some of the economists will know this. Contractors have market power and they have the ability to raise prices. There is one of the biggest challenges that we encountered throughout the spending review is the lack of data. And it wasn't just lack of data, but it was also the lack of good quality and reliable data. We found a whole lot of errors on BAS, for instance, that were problematic around infrastructure expenditure being misclassified. And lastly, even if you get to a point as the Eastern Cape Department of Education, where you've hired an implementing agent, the implementing agent has hired contractors, the contractors have built the school, for some reason, and we couldn't quite figure out what are the factors driving it, there's a very slow rate of translation from construction to completion and from completion to handover. The issues within the Eastern Cape Department. And when you do a process analysis, you'd need, in order for this, to gain some level of process inefficiency, you'd need to address all of these along the way, because you can't just address, having an implementing agent, because the rest of the chain is not working, the rest of the delivery chain. So you need a multi-pronged approach to resolving some of these problems. So what have we spent on school infrastructure? Now here there's a big caveat. I think the colleagues in the Eastern Cape submitted over the two spending reviews in education, submitted close to 21 requests for data, emails, memos to the Department of Basic Education over a 6-month period. We struggled to get data. Particularly, we struggled to get project data. And that is incredibly problematic, because for an infrastructure project, you really want to hone into, let's say it's an infrastructure project to build a small primary school. You really want to get to that level, what was the budget? what was the specifications, how much did they actually spend, was there any overrun, how long did it take, and so on. The Eastern Cape Department of Education produced two asset registers out of the 5 years that we needed. One of the challenges that they had in producing, for instance, asset registers and both the final asset register and the work in progress is very useful because it has project level data. So each project has to be itemized in the asset register. Unfortunately, I think, and Michael will help me if I've gotten it wrong, but I think the service provider who was commissioned to do the asset register for the Eastern Cape province hadn't handed it over, so they didn't have a complete set of asset registers. So we couldn't really use the data. And you know, when you look at 2 years worth of data, it does nothing to tell you about a trend. So we relied on BAS, and there was also a database that we managed to access with selected projects from the quantity surveyor in the department. So how much have we spent? So, you know, except for the COVID year where you can see, you know, expenditure dropped dramatically or significantly, Eastern Cape spends between 1.4 and 1.6 billion rand every year on school infrastructure. There is a bit of spending in the actual, most of it goes into the infrastructure program. There is a bit of spending on in the public ordinary school program, mostly for repairs and rehabilitation, but it's minor. If you look at the school infrastructure by the type of investment, by the nature of investment, and by that we mean, is it new, old, refurbished, or upgraded infrastructure, you'll see that a new infrastructure accounts for about a quarter of all spending. But most of the Eastern Cape infrastructure spending is on upgrades and additions. So there's been quite a big shift between in terms of moving away from, if you look at the early in 2010 or the late 2000s, there was a big push for new infrastructure. The focus of the province has shifted to upgrading, adding, and rehabilitating infrastructure. So significant, almost significant shift in policy when it comes to infrastructure. So in total, we've spent about 7 billion rand on school infrastructure in the Eastern Cape over these last 5 years. When you break down that infrastructure by the type of school, again, you'll see that there's been a lot of work done in terms of spending on secondary schools, which account for close to half, about 44% of total infrastructure spend. The Eastern Cape is doing away with combined schools. Combined schools are basically primary and secondary schools. But you can see it's doing away with with combined schools, so the spending on primary schools has declined. So if you look at school infrastructure spending by district, and this is one area where you can see the data problems, even in BAS, which is a standardized database. If you want to see how much money is going towards the various districts and is the department achieving its intended aim of, you know, rehabilitating and upgrading rural districts, well, it's difficult to say because, you know, the department itself, you know, doesn't code its expenditure well. So 16% of all expenditure on infrastructure could not be classified. So we don't know whether it went to rural or urban schools or what was it spent on? Which district is this money flowing to? We also had a look at, professional fees can account for a fair amount of, or a large proportion of an infrastructure project. And what we found is that there's large variability in the average professional fees as a percentage of total spend on that infrastructure project across different types of schools. What was really interesting is that smaller school projects, school infrastructure projects, tend to attract higher fees. And here I think that there's really an argument to be made for packaging smaller infrastructure projects better so that you can increase the expenditure efficiency of these projects. So if you package them well, it's smaller infrastructure projects, they're a sizable amount, you can negotiate a lower professional fee. We also got some data, it's very sparse, but it was some data on unit cost analysis. And what we could make out is that the minimum size for a grade R classroom, now this is in terms of the National Department has released norms and standards. And in those norms and standards, it tells you how big must a grade R classroom be, how big must the staff space be, how big must a general classroom be. So you have guidelines on the square meterage. So the minimum size for grade R classroom is about 60 square meters. Most grade R classrooms in the Eastern Cape fall between 24,000 Rand and 28,000 Rand gross building area per square meter, right? So you have a very, and this is what you want to see in construction projects. We call it we call it a right tail distribution, where the average cost is clustered, or the mean is clustered around on the left hand side, and then you have a long tail to the right. So this is a good thing. We're seeing that for grade R classrooms, there is some level, this suggests that there's some level of cost control around grade R classrooms. That said, the one worrying thing, and you'll see it in the next slide too, is that the minimum and maxima have such a big range. So if you look at the lowest cost per square meter was 19,470. This is close to Port Alfred. Port Alfred is, sort of towards the north of the province. But you compare that to the highest cost per square meter, which was 75,000 Rand that the department was paying to build a 60 square meter grade R classroom close to Mthatha. So there's definitely things that can be done from a procurement perspective, from a cost management perspective, to tighten the distribution. You want a right tail distribution, but you don't want very high maximum prices. The picture actually changes a bit when it comes to generic classrooms. Most generic classrooms fall between 13,000 and 31,000 per square meter. The max and minima here is not too bad. Basically, the maximum is twice the minimum, so it's not a big range. And that is the distribution of costs per grade R. So essentially what we can say is that most of the grade R classrooms, not the grade R, most of the generic classrooms that in our sample, this is a sample, this is not all projects in the Eastern Cape, are built between 15,000 and 17,000 Rand per square meter. Unfortunately, we don't have we don't have this data for other provinces, because it would have been really useful to compare to other provinces and to see how does the Eastern Cape compare on average per square meter to others. Right.
Sorry, Amanda, we just asked Sibusiso to. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. So what are we getting for what we are spending? So what I did is the IRM data set is a really valuable data set. You can take the IRM data, and for those of you who are data wonks, and put it into Power BI, which is a free program that you can access as a Treasury official. So it'll tell you, you can then filter. As long as you have the GIS coordinates, you can hone into a school and get data on the school, or you can look at, or you can play around with the variables to see, how things change over time. So very, very useful tool for Treasury officials, particularly if you have GIS coordinates. So where are we building school infrastructure in the Eastern Cape? So if you remember the Eastern Cape, we are building it largely to the north of the province in what we call, what is the former Transkei. It is the most rural provinces in the Transkei, and you can see sort of towards Port Alfred, Alfred and Zoel, and so on. A lot of infrastructure activity. Now, these are all the infrastructure projects over a 5-year period, between 2018 and 2021. You can see there is some activity around the urban centers in Port Elizabeth and in Buffalo City. Very little activity towards the inland areas of the province. So let's look at the number of projects. We looked at 5,396 projects in total. You can see that the Eastern Cape Department's performance in terms of bringing projects online is variable. It jumps around quite a bit, between years, but, has the expenditure analysis confirms most of the money is going towards upgrading and adding to school infrastructure. If you then break this down, the IRM data, does everyone know what the IRM data stands for?
Why don't you tell us?
Because I don't know. I know the thing. I was wondering if anyone else knew it. I think it's the integrated reporting and monitoring tool or something like that. But anyway, let me just explain, Elaine. It is a database that the National Treasury has developed that sits within, I think, the IGR unit. I'm sure Julia's in the room. She might correct me. And it basically provides a lot of data on infrastructure projects across various sectors. So you can get projects in transport, health, on provincial roads, on education, on community halls, for instance. As long as it's an infrastructure project, it will sit in the IRM data set. So that data set is incredibly useful to do performance analysis on your infrastructure projects. So this is where this data comes in. And the IRM data set basically allows you to see how far your project is in terms by stage of completion. So, it categorizes. If a project is between 1 and 25%, you must report it under that category. So it moves from construction to practical completion and to final completion. Now, there's a big difference between practical completion and final completion. Practical completion is when you have, let's assume it's a school, you've built the school, and now it's a question of the implementing agent verifying it, ensuring that you've built, has a contractor. This is in the practical completion phase. This is when you deal with the snag list. If you've ever built a house, this is the last set. You've built it. It's there, you're going through the snag list, you're checking for errors, you're checking for quality and so on before it can be handed over. So the practical completion stage is the sort of error checking, quality assurance phase once a school is complete. or a piece of infrastructure. It could be a school fence. The final completion stage is when you're ready to hand over. You've actually commissioned the school and you are ready to hand over. Other here is a whole set of other indicators or information that you have in the IRM. It's projects in the design phase, projects that have been put on hold, projects that have been cancelled, projects in the tender phase, and so on. So anything before you enter construction, or if and there are very few projects actually that have been completely cancelled in the Eastern Cape. So from the IRM, aside from seeing, where projects are in terms of their stage of completion, we can also calculate the average construction time for these projects in the Eastern Cape. Now, I've taken it from the time you start construction to the time you finish construction and you hand it over. That's how I've calculated it. Part of the reason that I didn't calculate it from design, from initiation, design, and tendering stage is because those processes take a really long time. On average, you're looking in the Eastern Cape, the pre-initiation, the design, the feasibility, and the tendering stages taking close on to 3 years across school infrastructure projects. This is just the construction time. So a couple of things. It's in years. For a large school in the province, it takes 5.29 years to build a large school for over 1,000. Remember, the Department of Education classifies it. So large school, I think, is over 1,000 learners. It takes now a micro school is a school classified or defined as any school where you have 135 learners or less. Often it's like 2 or 3 classrooms and 1 admin building. It's a small school. But to build a micro school takes 2 years in the Eastern Cape. Which, again, it would be nice to have done a comparison with other provinces. I think GTAC might do that because they have access to the IRM database, but these are not short lead times. If you want the average time taken to build a school across all different categories of infrastructure in the Eastern Cape, you're looking at close to 4 years to build a school. To put it into perspective, this is on the map over a 5-year period, all the infrastructure projects in the Eastern Cape. 5,396, right? Of those, within those 5 years, we only completed 10% of the infrastructure projects. So what does that mean? 10% were completed and handed over in a 5-year period. About a third of them are stuck in this final or practical completion stage. And the key issue is, why are they stuck? Well, they're stuck for several reasons that we pointed out. One, maybe the contractors don't have the capacity to complete it. But the next thing is, there is a real problem around the management of cash flow in the Eastern Cape. So what normally happens is that a project will go into, it'll move from 50 to 60% to 70%, it'll go into the next stage. There's a payment milestone for the contractor. The Eastern Cape Department might delay that payment, which means that the contractor is unable to complete it. So those delays, a lot of these delays, and part of the reason for the slow completion rate or final completion rate in the Eastern Cape is around the management of funding through the EIG. So the other thing that I do want to point out is that the one thing that we did also related to this cash flow issue is that, you know, in the last year, in 2020, or was it 2019, in one of the years, you know, the Eastern Cape's accrued invoices, that is invoices that they moved the next year, as a percentage of their total spending, was close to 15%. It was like 151 million rand moved to the following year because they couldn't pay it in the current year. So I think let's do a little question. Let me see if I have the question here. I'm going to put, thanks, Andreas. Infrastructure reporting model was what IRM stood for. I'm going to put a URL with a question. It's 1 minute. It'll take you 1 minute, Elaine, to answer. It's there. So the key question is, you know, given what we've presented, is there light at the end of the tunnel? And what needs to be done? Can everyone see the chat?
It's clear to me. Yes. I think so. We're good. So if everybody just go to SurveyMonkey and just answer the question.
Thanks, Elaine.
Let's give it 1 more minute, but you'll see as the results come in, we're looking for approximately 54 inputs, if everybody does it.
I have 3 or 4. Can we give them another minute, Elaine, if you don't mind?
Absolutely. If you just click on that link, it takes you immediately to the questions. Make your option or click your option and push send or done. In the meantime, Julia also explained to us IGR is the home of the IRM.
Oh, thanks, Julia.
Are people responding?
Yeah, we have about 20 responses.
Come on, everybody! It's anonymous. You don't, your details are not shared, and it's an important question. Let's take it. Just click on SurveyMonkey, go, and it takes you like 10 seconds. As a matter of fact, it's a matter of clicking a button and you're out. And as I said, it's totally anonymous. Nobody knows who voted what. We'll give it another 30 seconds, 1 minute, and then we'll see what the rates were.
Okay, we have 25 responses. Okay, so let me share my screen quickly. I hope everyone can see that. Right. So you have quite different views here. We asked, you know, given what you've heard today, do you think the Eastern Cape Department of Education has the capacity to deliver school projects on time and within the budget. You know, about 16 of us are eternal optimists. We thought that they could, but about 12 of us thought that, 48% thought that we don't think the department has the capacity to deliver, and something radical is needed to deal with these bottlenecks and to unblock the school infrastructure program. About 36 people said that, the department does have some capacity to deliver, but it'll need a lot more support from national department. But I think that about half of the people in this room think that, there is a need to do something more radical to unblock the school infrastructure program, Elaine. Okay, let me end with this. Some of the things that I think the Eastern Cape should do, and I've put it in a very direct way. But first, you need to appoint people and companies who can deliver, and that is from the implementing agents right through to the contractors. If a contractor can't deliver and your school is on hold for 2 years while you take the contractor to court, it's the learners that are suffering. So doing that due diligence upfront, making sure your vetting is better, rethinking your preferential procurement so that you balance out local procurement and other contractors will help you bulk or improve the ability to deliver on your program. So something more is needed within the Eastern Cape. So 1, appoint people and companies who can deliver. 2, do not bite off more than you can chew. This is something that is probably a negative consequence of our grant frameworks. I know we take the money back, but sometimes a grant framework will incentivize a province to take on more than they can possibly do. So you can see on those maps, lots and lots of projects, very few that are completed. And so you have to ask yourself, there's about 1,000 projects a year. Does the department have the capacity to deliver 1,000 projects a year? And if your answer is no, then you need to ask yourself, what can it deliver? Because our result shouldn't be about the number of projects. It is the number of schools that are functional, the number of schools that are having handed over and are being used. That should be the ultimate indicator, not just the number of projects. And so the grant frameworks, we need to remove those incentives to create sausage factories in provinces. Finish what you start. Critical message. There's delays. I do not understand why we have over 1,800 projects sitting in the practical completion stage. They've been built. The water is there. The electricity is there. Why is it sitting there? Something needs to be done to move them and to hand them over to principals so that learners can use the infrastructure. And lastly, it's about minding your mullahs. The Department of Education in the Eastern Cape, one of the most important things it could potentially do is manage its cash flow on infrastructure projects well. So the 3 things that need to come together is performance management of its contractors and its implementing agent, managing its own cash flow well and managing itself well. You get those 3 things right, or you attempt to address those 3 things, you'll find more movement, I think, in the infrastructure project. Elaine, I think that is it from me. I've spoken probably way too much, but maybe we could take some questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amanda. This was fascinating. Let me see, and such an important topic. Let's see a show of hands for questions to Amanda on the Eastern Cape project. Okay, I see Hopulang. Balu. Hopalong, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. Hi, Amanda, and thank you for a great presentation. This is Hopalong Silabalo from Equal Education. So this work is obviously quite critical to, the research you've conducted is critical to the work that we're doing. I'm just curious to know, like, we are also struggling with procurement data. I mean, we work with Imali too, with the Budget Justice Coalition and the like. And procurement is a big part of that work. And and procurement data is a big part of that work. I'm wondering, you said that you had to PIA, I assume you had to PIA or possibly just like send requests to the ECDOE to get some data. You scoured the Treasury website. Are there any other platforms that you think we can be using to get data? And I mean, this question is also to folks that are in the room that know. We've been trying to get access to the EFMS, but it's been really difficult to do that because apparently it's a private site for the department and other departments. We've been using the IRM. My colleague Liz is in the room and she's helped us get quite important data from there as well, but it's not comprehensive. It's not like all the so when we were searching for a particular school where we knew there's a project, like that school would not be captured in the IRM. So I'm just wondering what ways we can get around this, what ways we can advocate for data from the EFMS, for example, to be made public, and also the procurement bill, which has kind of been at a standstill since submissions were made, I think last year sometime. Thank you.
Amanda?
Thanks. So there's two aspects to this problem. First, we, as I said when I started the presentation, the Eastern Cape Provincial Treasury tried very hard itself to get the data. There were memos between the DG of the Eastern Cape Treasury and the DG of the Department of the Provincial Department of Education. Unfortunately, we couldn't get much. We had to use, as you probably know, the IRM data. We did get a project database that was maintained internally. It was used as a benchmarking tool, which is where we got some of these cost estimates. But part of the problem, and it's not just in school infrastructure, it's that if you think about it, as a country, we really haven't developed the infrastructure systems to report. If you compare us to a developed country like Australia, you have a fairly good infrastructure system where you can see what are the specifications on the project, what is the unit cost per square meter on things like on the different types of infrastructure and so on. We just don't have that. Where does it sit? It sits in the procurement department in literally pages and pages and thousands of pages of submissions by contractors. So the level of detail that we would have wanted is, in my view, is just not out there. The only way to get that is going into a bill of quantities for a specific project, collecting that, capturing it, and then using that using that to analyze it. But it is not readily available, unfortunately.
Thanks, Amanda. Hopalong, do you have a follow-up question? Are you good?
No, covered. Thank you.
Okay, Elizabeth.
Hi. So I'm also from Equal Education. Just listening to you, right? Okay, this presentation just makes me angry on so many levels. But my question is basically, if there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and we are hoping that there is at least a glimmer, so that we can, salvage it and work with it. How can civil society organizations such as ours assist the department? Because obviously when we try to engage with the department, we get this impression that nothing is wrong, like everything is hunky-dory. their spokespeople are very nice and very convincing. When they are in the media, nothing is going astray. But when we go on school visits, we see these things in black and white. And most times you find that even school communities themselves don't know what is happening or what they are meant to be getting. All they know is that there was a promise made, maybe a contractor or an implementing agent was taken there to as a meet and greet, at the very beginning, and nothing has been happening for the next 4, 5, 6 years. And yet, when you go, when we look at the information on Treasury's website, even though it is outdated, we see that there has been money spent, but we are not seeing any physical indication of where that money is actually going to. So perhaps in acknowledging that the department has a serious issue with capacity, how can other people be of help so that we can make sure that these contractors and implementing agents are actually delivering on the services that we are paying for, so that school communities are relieved of the infrastructure problems and challenges they are facing?
Elizabeth, I'm very happy I don't have to answer that question. Amanda, do you have any ideas?
It's a really tough question to answer. So, there's a lot of things that we've learned over the last decade from this new field called implementation science and complexity science, right? We know that the school infrastructure program is a complex program. We know from implementation science that when you're stuck and you're not delivering at the pace that you should be delivering, you need some sort of fundamental reform. And often that fundamental reform comes in the form of bringing the right people and the right role players together. My sense is that if we wanted to unblock and accelerate this, the delivery of school infrastructure, we do need to think about it and find different solutions. But mostly, we need to get people into the room together and come up with a solution, a collective solution that helps. And it's not about necessarily penalizing or naming and shaming the Eastern Cape Department of Education. It is about coming up with a solution that works. So let's borrow from, implementation science and complexity science and figure out what the problems is. I showed a delivery chain, Elaine, up earlier. Those are all in the smaller problems that the bottlenecks in the delivery chain, those are all solvable. You might not be able to solve the big problem, but you can certainly unblock the bottlenecks in the delivery chain. It's a good place to start. Sorry, Elizabeth, I'm not sure that's a very helpful answer.
Thanks, Amanda. Maybe I also would like just to come in here and ask you. You referred to the bottleneck at the practical practical completion stage. Do you mind just to maybe share a little bit, what do you think, what can be done there, or what is the bottleneck there? Because as you say, you can see the end, it's in sight. It should, this is when we see on news, this stadium or another infrastructure project. I drove past a hospital just recently, long grass growing, it's just never been opened. It's standing there, and then it goes to pieces. So what I'm sure this is not just a challenge in school infrastructure. I think it's across infrastructure projects. Why do you think the bottleneck sits at the practical completion stage, or there is such a bottleneck there?
So I think in the Eastern Cape, there are probably, in my mind, two main reasons. The first one is the capacity of, and this is, let me just declare upfront that this might be a bit of conjecture because no one could answer that question in the Eastern Cape Department itself. So what we're trying to do is just pulling the pieces from different interviews that we did. The first bottleneck is around the capacity of the contractor. Often what contractors will do is they will run through their money. They reach the 75% to 100%, and you're moving into practical completion. So they get paid a massive milestone in that last construction phase. And then they just don't leave because, you know, they are small companies. They just don't leave enough money to deal with the final snag list, if I can call it that. The correction of errors, you know, making sure that you've met the specifications and so on. So the first thing is it's the actual contractors and the capacity of contractors. That could be a problem. And remember, in the Eastern Cape, you're using a lot of smaller contractors because your pool of contractors is not that big. The next thing is the Eastern Cape itself has not been great, or the Department of Education has not been great at managing its cash flow. So what it will do is it will take the money from a project that's almost complete, that's just about to move into the final completion stage, and put it into somewhere else when it runs out of money. Or it will delay the invoice until the next year to pay a contractor that's close to completing a project. So it's fundamentally cash flow problems and the poor management of contracts and cash flows from both sides, the side of the contractor as well as the side of the Eastern Cape Department of Education.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay, so let's see any final questions. Elizabeth, your hand is still up. Is it a new hand or a previous hand?
No, it's a follow-up. And the follow-up is that we have to have a way forward. We cannot, you see, all of this is not news to us. We've been dealing with this for years. We have reports on it. So the question then becomes, what then can Treasury do to assist this crisis that we are facing, right? Because it is coming from every angle. It's not just one issue. How can Treasury then assist? Is it a matter of taking school building out of the hands of the department and give it to public works, for instance, so that the Department of Education can concentrate on delivering education purely as their mandate, so that they are not overstretching themselves, doing things that they are not equipped to do, and solve the capacity issue? Or what are the other alternatives? We need to investigate or explore some of the ways, we can overcome this challenge, because we know these problems already. They are not new.
Thanks. Amanda, I'm going to also, I note Spencer's hand from Treasury is also up, as well as Andreas. I'm going to also ask them to come in on this specific question. I know I'm being extremely opportunistic now, Spencer and Andreas, but I mean, Amanda, please go ahead, respond, and then Spencer, when you come in with your question, comment, please also, if you don't mind, consider Elizabeth's question, and the same to Andreas.
So Elena, I think before I answer, maybe we can ask Spencer and Andreas to come in, and then I'll answer all three together, if that's okay.
No problem. So then let's get Spencer and then Andreas to follow. I'm just going off camera for network for the moment.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Elaine. Thanks, Amanda, for the presentation. It's very interesting and in some ways eye-opening, in other ways confirming things, I think, as Elizabeth says, that we either knew or thought we knew before. Just a question first. Did your review include any of the projects completed or done or being done by the School Backlogs Grant? In other words, being done by the National Department. It would be very interesting to see not even outside of the province, but to see within the province if there are any price differentials between projects paid for and administered and monitored and managed by the School Backlogs Grant compared to those done by the Eastern Cape Education Department. If you did do that, that would be interesting to see or get a sense of. And then the other point I want to make is maybe more a comment. It's on your slide where you showed the process and highlighted the bottlenecks at various stages of the process of infrastructure delivery. What was significant for me, and this is perhaps in the context of multiple requests for many additional billions of rands for infrastructure in the province, this province in particular, is that there are a number of challenges there that you raise, but none of them relate to a shortage of funding. And those bottlenecks are the things that are hindering, that they're standing in the way of efficient delivery and completion of the thousands of projects. So I suppose that, as I say, is just for noting. It's just a comment, something that for me stands out. Another one, of course, is one from your recommendations, the fact that the pool of contractors of people who can work on these projects is so small, and that also is standing in the way of completing those that are there, but also expanding because the need is so great. We know the need is quite great in that province, and that's a practical solution that is in the hands of the people making the rules there for infrastructure projects in the Eastern Cape, which you have in your recommendation. So in answer to one of the answers to Elizabeth's question is that the local procurement rules maybe should not be as local, or to allow for expertise to come from elsewhere in South Africa to ensure that projects get done and are completed, and that local capacity can then be properly developed by contractors from elsewhere in South Africa who have expertise. I think that would go a long way towards addressing some of the problems. I don't want to comment further about where to locate the function in the province, because I don't know the capacity of the Eastern Cape Department of Public Works to deliver public infrastructure projects that they're responsible for. So let me not say that that's a good idea. Thanks.
Thanks, Spencer. Let's go to Andreas. We've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay,
So,
I'll try and be very quick. I mean, I guess pretty much picking up where Spencer left off. I mean, I think there are two critical issues here. The one is we do have to relook at our procurement framework, and in particular the strategy that we're using to deliver infrastructure. And I think at the heart of the problem is that we have too many objectives we're trying to meet with one item. So you want to deliver a school within budget and on time, but you want to make sure you're using local labor, you want to support local small contractors. Those are often very, very difficult objectives to balance in a single project. And I do think we need to rethink the framework of how we can, say, prioritize the cost-efficient delivery of the infrastructure, which may very well involve using very large national construction firms, but where you then place obligations to support and develop smaller contractors or subcontractors. And I think we in the past we did do this, and we did it reasonably well. I know there was some work I did many years ago with Sean Phillips for Limpopo, and in fact we developed a framework for this, where you can try and prioritize these different objectives. So I think that framework needs to be reviewed, because at the moment this doesn't work. And I think if you could look at something where you have a large contractor involved, I think you also have much better economies of scale. I mean, I know in the Eastern Cape in particular, the geographic distances, etc., all add costs. So I think that's the one sort of comment or thought that I want to put on the table. I think the second is quite simply, we just need better governance and we need enforcement. I think, building schools is not rocket science. It's like, this is one of those infrastructure spaces where we know what to do. We have standard infrastructure, contracting, there are clear payment milestones linked to completion certificates. We've got the IDMS. I'm saying that this is a well-regulated, well-managed space. The fact that people aren't managing within that, I think, is a problem, and people should be held accountable. If things are not completed, or if things are completed and not paid. So these are very standard steps that could be enforced quite easily. So yeah, who does that? I'm not sure, but I think this for me is really, it shouldn't be that difficult to build school infrastructure. Yeah, let me stop there for now. I've got other thoughts as well, but we'll have another chat some other day. Okay.
Thanks, Andreas. I think we're going to ask Amanda just to come in with her final comments, and then I'm going to close the meeting.
Thanks. So I agree with Spencer. First, let me answer Spencer's question. We couldn't get the data, so we tried to do a cost comparison between the EIG and the school backlog infrastructure grant, because, as you know, the Eastern Cape is the largest recipient of that indirect grant. Unfortunately, we could not get the data from national, and you must also remember that the school infrastructure backlog grant is not recorded on the IRM system. So we couldn't even do comparisons on the IRM between the two. It's unfortunate, but I do think that it is useful to see the two different models side by side. If someone wants to take that up or gets the data from national, the GTAC stuff is published online, I think, so you can easily per square meter do that cost comparison. I fundamentally think that Andreas is right. Actually building a school and putting school fencing, building school toilets and so on, the infrastructure part is not difficult. What makes it complex is everything, is all the noise. It's actually a bit of a chaotic system. It's all the noise around the school infrastructure program, which is, the lack of capacity, people not quite doing what they should be doing, the limited oversight, the poor cash flow management, the poor due diligence processes, the weaknesses in contract management. Again, those are things that are regulated and they can be solved. It's not an unsolvable. This is not an NP problem in maths. This is definitely solvable. But ultimately, someone has to take responsibility for working through it and trying to resolve these things. Elaine?
Yes, thanks a lot. Thank you very, very much, Amanda. Everybody, thank you very, very much for joining us this afternoon. As you can see, we could have gone on for still some time to come. It's such a fascinating, but also a topic that's close to our hearts. I really want to say thank you to the team who did all this good work, and everybody here for your comments and input. We look forward to see you again next Friday, when we'll deal with another exciting topic. Have a great Friday afternoon and enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.